She boarded the commuter train just after dusk on a cool evening in the spring of 2003. Her name was Emma Collins, 23 years old, fresh out of college, and working her first steady job in the city. She had been texting her roommate only minutes before the train pulled away from the platform, reminding her she would be home in 40 minutes. She always texted when she was on her way. It was habit, and it gave her family and friends comfort. She chose a seat in the second carriage, not crowded, not empty, settling by the window with a book she had been working through all week. Other passengers remembered her clearly. Dark hair tucked behind one ear, glasses balanced on her nose, a scarf wrapped tightly against the night air. She looked like any other young woman returning from a long day, planning nothing more dramatic than dinner and rest. For most of the trip, nothing seemed unusual. The train rumbled steadily between stations, fluorescent lights flickering slightly above, passengers rocking gently with each shift of the track. A few students laughed near the back, an older man dozed in his seat. Emma kept her head down, immersed in the book on her lap. Witnesses later told police she hardly moved at all except to glance once at her phone and adjust her bag on the seat beside her. To anyone watching, it looked like a safe, ordinary ride home. But somewhere between two stations, something happened that no one could explain. When the train slowed briefly in a dark stretch of track, some riders claimed they heard a muffled sound, something like a sharp cry or the slam of metal echoing in the tunnel. Others dismissed it as the normal rattle of machinery. The lights flickered once, then steadied again. When the train moved forward, most passengers thought nothing of it. By the time the train pulled into the final station, the moment had already faded into the blur of another commute. It was only when people began gathering their things to step off that something seemed wrong. Emma's phone still rested on the seat beside her. Her bag was slumped against the window, but the young woman herself was gone. No one had seen her leave, no one had seen her move. She had simply vanished. Station staff were the first to check. They swept the carriages quickly, thinking she may have slipped into the restroom or changed seats. Nothing. When her bag and phone were handed to the lost and found office, they assumed she had left in a hurry and would return. But when her roommate called police hours later, panicked that Emma never arrived home, those items became something much darker, evidence that she had disappeared in transit. Police arrived that night and began retracing the journey. Officers interviewed passengers still lingering on the platform, asking what they had seen. Most could only recall Emma sitting quietly, her eyes on her book. A few swore she was still there only minutes before the last stop. One man remembered the scarf, the way it caught the fluorescent glow. But no one saw her get off, no one saw her struggle, and no one could say for sure when she was last visible. Investigators turned immediately to surveillance footage. Every train was equipped with cameras positioned in each carriage. But when technicians pulled the recordings, something was wrong. The camera covering Emma's carriage had malfunctioned that evening. The feed was frozen, a static image showing only the empty aisle. For the crucial 40 minutes of her journey, there was no visual record. It was as if someone had erased her from the train altogether. By morning, police expanded the search. Teams walked the track between the two stations, combing through brush, gravel, and tunnel edges with flashlights. Dogs were brought in, handlers guiding them along service paths. Nothing turned up, no clothing, no signs of a fall, no trace of blood. If Emma had left that train between stations, there should have been evidence. Instead, the ground was silent. Her family was notified within hours. Her parents rushed to the city, frantic, demanding answers. Reporters swarmed the platforms by the second day, flashing cameras into the train carriages, asking strangers if they had seen a girl vanish before their eyes. Headlines spoke of a phantom commuter, a woman who entered but never exited, lost somewhere on the steel rails of the line. Detectives admitted privately that they were stumped. A disappearance from a train in motion was almost unheard of. Suicide seemed unlikely. No body, no impact, no sign of deliberate action. Robbery was dismissed. Her wallet and phone remained untouched. If she had stepped off, she would have needed access to a door that wasn't meant to open in transit. If she had been taken, it would have required planning, timing, and a place to vanish into without being seen. Every scenario seemed impossible, yet one of them had to be true. As hours stretched into days, tension grew. Her friends printed flyers, plastering them on streetlights and station walls. Volunteers searched the surrounding neighborhoods, thinking maybe she had wandered disoriented into the night. Detectives interviewed every worker on duty that evening, every passenger who remembered the dark tunnel where the lights flickered. Still, there was no breakthrough. The most chilling detail remained her belongings. Her phone showed the last outgoing text to her roommate, a simple, "On the train." Home soon, her bag contained her work papers, her wallet, and the paperback she had been reading, its bookmark lodged neatly halfway through. To investigators, it was as if she had stood up mid-sentence and evaporated. By the end of the week, the story was national news. Commentators debated safety on public transport. Activists demanded better surveillance systems, and Emma's family held a vigil on the platform where she was last seen. Candles lined the concrete, their flames bending in the night air as if waiting for her to return. But Emma never walked off that train. And as detectives closed their initial report with no answers, one chilling truth lingered. Somewhere between two stations, in a carriage where the cameras failed, a young woman disappeared without a trace. And the question that would haunt investigators for decades was simple. Where did she go? The first 2 days after Emma Collins vanished would decide everything. Detectives knew it. Statisticians repeated it. If someone wasn't found within that window, the chances of survival dropped dramatically. And so, as dawn broke on the morning after her disappearance, the search began in earnest. Transit police were first on scene, standing on the platform with clipboards and radios, their eyes scanning carriages that had already been scrubbed of passengers the night before. Officers leaned into corners, under seats, peered into restrooms. But Emma was not there. The personal items already logged, the phone, the bag, the book, sat in evidence lockers, sterile and useless. They could confirm she had boarded. They could not confirm she had ever left. By mid-morning, homicide detectives joined the case, not because a murder had been proved, but because the scenario was already so unusual it demanded senior oversight. They traced the full path of the train, station by station, asking staff to recall anything irregular. Ticket vendors, janitors, platform attendants, everyone was questioned. Nobody remembered seeing her step off. Detectives then moved to passengers. Names were gathered from credit card purchases, surveillance stills from other carriages. They tracked down riders one by one, calling them in for interviews. Some remembered her clearly, the young woman with the scarf and glasses, reading near the window. Others barely noticed. And yet, when asked the crucial question, what happened between the second and third station, answers blurred. A few said they thought they heard something unusual, a sharp noise, maybe a scream muffled by steel in motion. Others dismissed it, saying the trains always made strange sounds in tunnels. No one could pinpoint the source. Back at headquarters, detectives turned again to surveillance. Dozens of feeds from across the line were reviewed. They confirmed Emma boarding at her home station, bag slung across her shoulder, stepping into the second carriage. Then, nothing. For 40 minutes, the camera inside her carriage showed only frozen static. Other angles proved useless, obstructed, blurry, too far away. The one piece of technology that should have captured her every movement had failed at the exact moment she vanished. For investigators, it felt like chasing a shadow. Meanwhile, her family was notified formally. Emma's parents arrived from out of town within hours, frantic and demanding answers. Her mother clutched the scarf from the evidence bag, refusing to let it go. Her father paced the halls, insisting someone on that train had to know more than they admitted. Friends gathered at the station with hastily printed flyers, Emma's smiling face beneath the word missing. They taped them to walls, lampposts, bus stops. By the afternoon, her image stared back at commuters across the city. Search dogs were brought in by late afternoon. Handlers guided them along the rails between the two key stations. The dogs pulled and barked, but no consistent scent trail appeared. It was as if Emma had never touched the ground outside that carriage. Officers fanned out into neighborhoods bordering the line, checking alleys, underpasses, abandoned lots. They knocked on doors, asked residents if they'd seen a disoriented young woman walking alone. Nothing. The first press conference came that evening. Reporters crowded behind the yellow tape as detectives stood stiffly, announcing the facts. Emma Collins boarded the 7:45 train. She never arrived home. Her possessions were recovered. There is no evidence of foul play, but all possibilities remain open. Cameras flashed, questions shouted, but answers were few. One journalist asked the question that had already begun echoing online. How does someone vanish from a sealed carriage in motion? That night, the search intensified. Officers with flashlights walked the tracks inch by inch, their beams bouncing off gravel and steel. They looked for blood, torn fabric, disturbed brush, anything to suggest Emma had stepped or been pushed off. Hours later, their report came back empty. No body, no clothing, no sign. As the first 48 hours reached their midpoint, theories began to divide. Some detectives suggested she may have chosen to vanish, staged a disappearance, walked away from her life. But those who knew Emma dismissed it. She had just signed a new lease, accepted a new job offer, made dinner plans with friends. Nothing suggested escape. Others leaned toward abduction. But how? The train doors between stations were electronically locked. Emergency releases existed, but using them left visible evidence. None had been triggered. To pull her from that train required knowledge, access, or sheer impossibility. By the second day, her disappearance dominated local headlines. Commuters whispered nervously on their rides. Parents clutched children closer. Rumors swirled. A predator using maintenance tunnels, a stalker who knew the system, even stories of people vanishing from this line before. Police tried to tamp down speculation, but the public sensed what detectives refused to say. Something was very wrong. Her parents gave their first interview that evening, standing under harsh lights, faces pale with exhaustion. Her mother pleaded into the microphones, begging anyone who had seen or heard something to come forward. Her father's voice cracked when he said, "She didn't just vanish. Somebody knows." But behind the cameras, detectives felt the weight of failure. Leads were drying up. Witness accounts contradicted each other. Surveillance offered no help. Forensics found nothing along the tracks. With every passing hour, hope slipped further away. The 48-hour mark closed with silence. No ransom call, no sighting, no evidence, only a train ride that ended without her. Detectives filed into the briefing room, staring at empty whiteboards where answers should have been. And as the case entered its third day, one chilling reality settled over everyone involved. The trail was already going cold. Detectives knew the first 2 days had slipped away without answers, but the third day brought a new theory that seemed almost too unsettling to ignore. While retracing the path of the train, one officer pointed out a stretch of track that ran unusually close to an old service tunnel. It wasn't marked on public maps, not listed on current transit documents, and when supervisors were questioned, some admitted they barely remembered it existed. The tunnel had been sealed decades earlier, built for maintenance workers during the line's expansion, then abandoned when newer routes made it redundant. Now it sat unlit, damp, and forgotten, its only entrances rusted shut but still technically accessible to someone who knew where to look. The discovery reignited speculation. If Emma had vanished between 2 stations, this hidden access point offered a chilling possibility. Could she have been lured or forced through a hatch in that dark stretch, pulled into the tunnel where no one could see? Detectives ordered immediate inspections. Crews in reflective vests pried open old doors, flashlights sweeping across dripping walls and graffiti etched by decades of trespassers. Dust and debris coated the floors. Rusted tools lay where they had been abandoned years earlier. It looked deserted, lifeless, and yet there was something about its proximity to the exact section where passengers reported hearing a muffled cry that made it impossible to dismiss. Forensics officers scoured every inch. They collected fabric fibers from nails protruding along the walls, photographed scuff marks on concrete floors, bagged discarded shoes and soda cans that might hold DNA. But as samples were tested, nothing linked back to Emma. The fibers were generic, the scuff marks too old, the shoes from long before 2003. It was as though the tunnel had swallowed her in rumor alone, leaving nothing tangible behind. Still, the tunnel theory took hold. Detectives briefed the press cautiously, saying they were exploring all infrastructure connected to the line. But the public drew its own conclusions. Newspapers ran headlines about a secret passageway under the tracks. Talk radio speculated about predators hiding in maintenance shafts. And soon, a phrase began circulating: the train corridor stalker. According to the rumor, a man had been using abandoned access points to attack unsuspecting women, vanishing back underground before police could react. There was no evidence, but the story spread faster than any official statement. Commuters began to glance nervously at dark stretches of track, imagining shapes moving in shadows. Parents warned their daughters never to ride alone after dusk. Transit officials issued public reassurances, but they could not erase the fact that Emma's disappearance had happened in the one carriage where cameras had failed, near the one section of line with hidden access no one remembered until too late. Detectives leaned into the theory, even as it frustrated them. They interviewed every worker who had ever held keys to those tunnels, digging through employment records that went back 30 years. A handful of disgraced employees surfaced, men dismissed for misconduct, theft, or violence. Their names were checked against police databases. Some were dead, others lived far from the city. None could be tied directly to Emma. Teams went back underground again and again, convinced they had overlooked something. They lowered fiber optic cameras into drainage grates, searched sealed alcoves, and sifted through rubble where collapses had blocked passageways. Each time, they emerged with nothing more than damp clothes and empty hands. One detective admitted privately that the tunnel seemed to toy with them, offering the perfect theory but withholding every scrap of proof. Emma's family watched the investigation twist itself into knots. Her father, standing beside volunteers distributing flyers, told a reporter that the tunnel idea was just another way of admitting they had no answers. "They're chasing ghosts," he said, voice breaking. "My daughter isn't in some storybook corridor. She's out there, somewhere real." His words stung, but even he couldn't ignore how the rumors kept coming back to that stretch of track, the dark place where the train always slowed, where the air seemed to change and the lights flickered. Within weeks, the case file thickened with tips about strange sightings near service entrances. Some claimed they saw a man in a maintenance vest loitering by fences. Others said they heard voices echoing from beneath the tracks at night. Police checked each one. Every report dissolved into nothing. No maintenance worker was unaccounted for, no tools missing, no evidence of trespass. Yet the fear lingered, heavy and unshakable. For commuters, the tunnel became more than a theory. It was a presence. Riders sitting in the second carriage would glance out the window as the train slowed through that section, staring into blackness where the walls seemed too close. A flicker of light, a shift in shadow, and hearts would pound faster. For Emma's family, those shadows became unbearable. Each vigil they held seemed to orbit that part of the line, as if answers lay just beneath their feet, sealed behind concrete. Detectives filed their reports, noting the tunnel as a possible route of abduction, but admitting they had no witness, no forensic match, and no sign Emma had ever set foot inside. The official conclusion, for now, was that she could have been forced off in that section, but they had nothing to prove it. It was a theory trapped between imagination and fact, a story with no body. As months passed, the tunnel faded from official briefings, replaced by broader appeals for information. But in public memory, it never went away. To this day, older commuters still talk about the corridor no one wanted to acknowledge, the stretch of line where a young woman may have slipped from reality into rumor. And as the investigation dragged on, one thing became clear. The shadows along the tracks were not giving up their secrets easily. Years passed, and with them, the sharp urgency of the first days gave way to a grinding silence that no family should ever endure. Emma's parents, unwilling to let her memory fade, began a ritual that would define their home for decades. Every night, without fail, they lit a candle in the front window, a small flame flickering against the dark. Neighbors came to know it as Emma's light, a beacon waiting for her return. On the anniversary of her disappearance, the family gathered with friends, placing more candles along the walkway, turning their house into a quiet vigil. Each year the crowd grew smaller, but her parents never missed a single one. The media kept the story alive in fits and bursts. Every few months, a newspaper would run a feature calling Emma's case one of the city's strangest mysteries. News anchors revisited the details during slow news cycles, replaying the same footage of the train, the same interview clips of her grieving parents. Online forums dissected the case, theorizing about tunnels, stalkers, and conspiracies. To the public, Emma became a symbol of vanishing without explanation. To her family, she remained a daughter who never came home. Detectives cycled through the case like chapters in a book nobody could finish. The first lead investigator retired 5 years after the disappearance, passing boxes of files to his replacement. That detective lasted another 8 years before leaving the force, still with no resolution. Each new team inherited a mountain of paperwork, interview transcripts, and photographs, the same unanswered questions circling endlessly. How could a young woman vanish from a moving train without a trace? Each detective began with determination, believing they would be the ones to finally solve it. Each one left defeated. The theories never stopped multiplying. Some pointed to voluntary disappearance. Perhaps Emma had grown tired of her life and orchestrated her own vanishing, slipping away into another city under a new name. But that theory collapsed against reality. Her bank account was never touched, her social security number unused, her passport gathering dust. Others insisted it had to be abduction, that someone knew the system intimately enough to exploit its weaknesses. But years of checks on employees, contractors, and ex-workers yielded nothing. Every theory hit the same wall of emptiness. For her parents, that emptiness was unbearable. Her mother sank deeper into silence, rarely leaving the house except for the annual vigil. She refused to redecorate Emma's room, keeping it exactly as it had been the night she boarded the train. Books on the shelf, scarves folded neatly, a half-written journal entry on her desk. Her father threw himself into advocacy, attending missing persons conferences, speaking on panels, demanding improvements to transit surveillance. But the weight of grief fractured even their closest ties. Friends who had once visited weekly stopped calling, unable to watch the family remain frozen in time. Some relatives grew resentful of the endless focus on Emma, arguments breaking out during holidays. The family unit, already fragile, splintered under the strain. Even Emma's circle of friends could not remain intact. At first, they organized search parties, printing flyers, standing on corners handing them out to strangers. As months turned into years, the group scattered. Some moved away, others drifted apart. A few admitted privately that they felt guilty being unable to help, guilty for continuing their own lives while Emma's seemed permanently suspended in 2003. Weddings, children, careers, milestones that should have been shared with her were carried out in silence, her absence a shadow in every photograph. The case became a cultural reference point, a story invoked whenever another person went missing. Reporters compared new disappearances to Emma's, reminding the public that her fate remained unsolved. Her name was mentioned in debates over transit safety, cited in budget hearings about camera upgrades, used as shorthand for the worst-case scenario. But behind the headlines, her family remained trapped in a cycle of private suffering. Every knock at the door, every unknown phone call carried a flicker of hope that never lasted. Detectives, too, struggled with the weight of failure. Some confessed off record that Emma's case haunted them more than any homicide they had worked. A body provided answers, however grim. Emma's disappearance provided nothing. No closure, no evidence, no explanation. Files piled up with notes scrawled in the margins. Check again. Revisit witness. Reanalyze fiber. Yet each revisit ended the same way. Dead ends and empty hands. Years blurred into decades. The candle in the window remained. The vigils became quieter, attended mostly by the same small group of loyal supporters. Each anniversary brought news crews back to the doorstep, microphones thrust forward, asking the same questions in slightly different words. Emma's parents, older now, still answered patiently. They clung to the belief that one day, somehow, the truth would surface. But behind their eyes was the exhaustion of people who had carried grief too long, who had lived with absence as if it were a permanent roommate. The mystery of Emma Collins had become more than a case file. It was a wound that never closed, a question that resisted answers no matter how many hands tried to solve it. And as the years stretched on, her family could only wait, their lives frozen between memory and the faint, unbearable hope that the next phone call, the next knock at the door, might finally tell them what happened in those dark minutes between stations. 10 years had passed since Emma Collins vanished, and though the case had grown cold, it had never gone silent. Detectives still fielded tips, most of them vague or easily disproven, but every so often one stood out enough to demand attention. That happened in the spring of 2013, when a man already in custody for a string of violent assaults on trains began talking. During interviews, he casually mentioned Emma's name, saying he knew where the tunnel girl went. The phrase struck detectives immediately. Emma's case had long been tied in rumor to maintenance tunnels along the tracks, and hearing it from a suspect already convicted of transit-related crimes made it impossible to ignore. The man claimed he had encountered Emma the night she disappeared. He described a scenario where she was forced into a disused service shaft, hidden away from sight. His details were murky, sometimes contradictory, but he spoke with such confidence that investigators took him seriously. After all, confessions in cold cases often came from offenders seeking bargaining chips for lighter sentences. But as detectives listened, they wondered if this was different. Was this a man finally cracking under the weight of secrets, or just another manipulator in a prison cell? Authorities wasted no time pursuing the lead. They pored over old maps of the railway system, identifying shafts and access points that had long since been sealed. Some had collapsed under decades of neglect. Others were buried beneath layers of concrete and earth. Crews were assembled to dig into the most likely sites. For days, the sound of jackhammers and heavy machinery echoed along forgotten sections of track as officers waited for signs of what might be buried below. When bones were finally discovered in one of the shafts, hope surged. News outlets reported it within hours, splashing headlines about remains found in tunnel linked to disappearance. Emma's parents were told cautiously that investigators might be close to an answer. For the first time in years, they allowed themselves to believe that the nightmare might be ending, that the candle in their window might finally be extinguished with peace instead of grief. But hope turned quickly to devastation. Forensic testing revealed the bones did not belong to Emma at all. They were decades older, fragments of victims lost to another time, another story of violence and neglect. The discovery reopened wounds for families of those long-forgotten individuals. But for Emma's parents, it was a cruel repetition of what they had endured before. Another cycle of raised expectations, then crushing silence. Her father described it bitterly as hope dangled in front of us, only to be yanked away. Detectives pressed the suspect again, demanding specifics. But under questioning, his confidence evaporated. His story shifted with each retelling. Dates no longer aligned, locations became vague, and when confronted with the forensic results, he smirked and said he had only wanted attention. He admitted to reading about Emma's case in old newspapers, repeating phrases he knew would trigger interest. I figured it would keep you coming back," he told one officer. The revelation infuriated investigators, who realized they had spent weeks chasing a mirage. Resources had been drained, families traumatized, and yet the man who sparked it all showed no remorse. Prosecutors considered filing charges for obstruction, but his existing sentences ensured he would remain behind bars for years regardless. In the end, he was dismissed as another phantom suspect, a man whose lies had bled into a case already drowning in uncertainty. For Emma's family, the aftermath was brutal. The discovery of bones, followed by the revelation that they belonged to strangers, left scars nearly as deep as the initial disappearance. Her mother retreated further from public view, refusing interviews for months. Her father's advocacy shifted into anger, his speeches no longer about hope, but about the cruelty of false leads. Friends who had seen them endure for a decade admitted quietly that the family seemed more broken than ever before. The public, too, grew weary. Commentators accused police of incompetence, chasing ghosts while failing to deliver answers. Online forums debated whether Emma's case had become unsolvable, a symbol of investigative futility. Each false trail fed skepticism, eroding faith in the system meant to protect. For the detectives still working the case, morale plummeted. They had believed, for a brief moment, that they were finally pulling the thread that would unravel the mystery. Instead, they found themselves right back where they started, staring into the same void. And yet, the tunnels lingered. Even as the suspect's confession was discredited, the theory refused to die. People couldn't shake the idea that Emma had been swallowed by the hidden veins beneath the city, that her body waited in darkness just beyond reach. The rumor of the train corridor stalker spread again, fueled now by grisly discoveries unrelated to her but close enough to deepen the legend. When the dust settled, Emma's file remained open but unchanged. A decade had passed and the case was no closer to resolution. What had begun as a promising lead had collapsed into another cruel trick of circumstance and deceit. The candle in the Collins window still burned, but now it flickered against a deeper shadow, the knowledge that even when bones were unearthed, they could still belong to someone else, leaving Emma lost and her family waiting. In 2018, 15 years after Emma Collins disappeared, her story surged back into public conversation when a group of urban explorers uploaded a series of unsettling photographs to an online forum. The images showed a sealed maintenance tunnel near the same stretch of line where Emma was last seen, a place officials had long claimed was inaccessible. The tunnel, built in the 1940s and closed in the 1970s, had been forgotten by most. Yet the explorers had found a way in, squeezing through a rusted ventilation grate. What they captured inside was enough to reignite speculation that Emma's fate was tied to the shadows beneath the city. The photos spread quickly. In one, graffiti sprawled across the concrete walls, crude drawings, strange names, dates carved into the surface. Another showed a row of abandoned chairs lined against a wall as if left in mid-use, their metal legs eaten with rust. Most disturbing of all were the discarded shoes, a scattered collection ranging from work boots to a child's sneaker, all covered in layers of dust. The explorers captioned their posts with eerie commentary, calling the place the Ghost Tunnel and hinting that it felt like a graveyard. For the Collins family, the images were unbearable. Emma's father stared at them for hours, convinced the tunnel was the missing piece investigators had overlooked for more than a decade. The detail that struck him hardest was not the graffiti or the shoes, but the geography. The tunnel ran directly beneath the stretch of track where multiple passengers once reported hearing a muffled scream on the night Emma vanished. That alignment could not be ignored. He began writing letters to local officials, demanding the tunnel be searched by professionals, not thrill-seekers with flashlights and cameras. Police at first dismissed the discovery. They pointed out that urban explorers often exaggerated their findings for attention. The shoes, they argued, could have been discarded decades earlier. The chairs were nothing more than relics from when the tunnel had been an active worksite. Graffiti proved nothing except that trespassers had found a way inside. To detectives, it looked like another distraction in a case already plagued with false trails. But family advocates disagreed. They rallied support, circulating petitions and contacting reporters who had covered Emma's disappearance years earlier. Soon, the story was back on local news, the images splashed across television screens and websites. Reporters asked why a tunnel so close to the line had never been thoroughly examined. The Collins family appeared on air, pleading for authorities to treat the discovery as more than internet noise. "If there's even the smallest chance my daughter was taken there," her father said, "then that tunnel needs to be searched." The mounting pressure forced officials to respond. By late summer, a small investigative team was dispatched to the site. Wearing protective gear, they followed the explorers' route through the grate and into the tunnel. The space smelled of rust and stagnant water, the air thick with dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. Their flashlights illuminated the same scenes from the photographs: graffiti stretching for yards, chairs collapsing under their own weight, shoes scattered like forgotten evidence. Each item was bagged, tagged, and logged, though investigators cautioned that age made any connection to Emma unlikely. Still, one detail kept drawing their attention: the tunnel's position relative to the line. Maps confirmed what Emma's family had suspected. The tunnel sat directly beneath the section where the train slowed on the night she disappeared, where the muffled cry had been reported. If someone had access to both the train and the tunnel, they could have pulled her off in darkness, vanishing underground before anyone realized what was happening. The theory was chilling, and for the first time in years, it felt plausible again. When the search was completed, officials announced that no human remains or identifiable evidence of Emma had been recovered. The graffiti, shoes, and furniture were dated back decades, long before 2003. Yet the tunnel itself remained a puzzle, a place that could not be ruled out. Investigators added it to the case file, noting it as an area of potential interest. For Emma's family, that wasn't enough. They wanted excavation, ground scans, a full forensic sweep. Anything less felt like another dismissal, another opportunity wasted. The photographs continued to circulate online, where they took on a life of their own. Theories multiplied, some reasonable, others spiraling into fantasy. But beneath the noise was a persistent question. How could authorities have overlooked a tunnel so perfectly aligned with the most suspicious stretch of track? The Collins family clung to that question, convinced the answer to Emma's disappearance still lay in those sealed walls. As the 15th anniversary of her vanishing passed, the family lit their candles once again, this time with a renewed plea to the public. The tunnel was no longer just a rumor or a forgotten space. It was real, it was accessible, and it matched the night's most chilling clue. And though police cautioned against drawing conclusions, one haunting possibility lingered in everyone's mind. Maybe Emma had never left that stretch of line at all. Maybe she had been waiting beneath it the whole time. In 2021, 18 years after Emma Collins vanished, the case finally broke free from rumor and into the realm of evidence. Pressure from family advocates combined with new leadership in the transit police led to the decision to re-enter the sealed tunnel with a full forensic team. This would not be another cursory inspection or a dismissal of internet speculation. For the first time in decades, professionals equipped with modern technology would scour every inch of the underground space. The tunnel had remained sealed since the limited search in 2018, left untouched after investigators initially claimed no evidence of relevance had been found. But families of the missing had continued to fight, citing the proximity of the tunnel to the stretch of line where passengers reported a scream. The discovery of Emma's case notes in a public archive, which mentioned overlooked maintenance maps, added fuel to the fire. By early 2021, the decision was made. The tunnel would be reopened with full forensic protocols, not just flashlight sweeps. On a damp March morning, crews descended into the earth. The entrance was widened to allow equipment through, the air vent grated off and sealed areas broken open. Forensics officers moved slowly, documenting every detail. Dust-coated walls were swabbed, rusted nails cataloged, even puddles of stagnant water sampled for potential biological traces. They worked in silence, except for the echo of boots and the occasional hum of portable lights. It was work done with a sense of reverence, as though they all knew what might finally emerge. Days into the sweep, the first discovery came almost by accident. A technician crouched near a section of wall where old support beams had splintered. On one of the rusted nails jutting from the beam, faint fibers clung stubbornly to the metal. When collected and placed under microscopic examination, the fibers revealed themselves as fabric threads, consistent with modern clothing. Not the heavy work gear of the 1970s when the tunnel was last used, but lighter materials typical of the early 2000s. The hairs on the back of every investigator's neck stood up. The significance was immediate. Until then, Emma's connection to the tunnel had been speculation, urban legend, fueled by rumor and photographs of discarded shoes. But the fibers shifted the case into something tangible. The lab confirmed that the threads aligned with materials common in women's clothing sold in 2002 and 2003. It was the first forensic evidence tying the sealed passageway to the timeline of Emma's disappearance. Then, days later, came the discovery that would change everything. Near a collapsed section deeper inside, a forensic officer used tweezers to remove what looked like a single hair caught in a crack of concrete. Under laboratory testing, the mitochondrial DNA matched Emma Collins. For the first time in 18 years, the case was no longer speculation. Emma had been inside the tunnel. The news hit like a thunderclap. Families who had long accused authorities of ignoring the obvious felt vindicated. Emma's parents, nearly 2 decades older now, stood at a press conference clutching each other's hands as the lead investigator confirmed the DNA match. Her father's voice broke when he said, "We always knew she was there. We just needed them to prove it." The atmosphere surrounding the case transformed overnight. What had been dismissed as an unsolvable mystery suddenly carried the weight of solvability. No longer could officials shrug it off as rumor. Emma's presence in that tunnel on the night she vanished was now fact. Detectives reopened files, dusted off witness statements, and began cross-referencing access logs of workers who might have known the sealed corridors still existed. But with the discovery came dread. If Emma's hair had been found, then so too had she entered, willingly or otherwise, into a space with no easy exit. The fibers suggested she may have brushed against nails while struggling. The hair suggested close contact with the walls. Both painted a chilling picture. Emma had not vanished into thin air, as so many headlines once claimed. She had been forced, or dragged, or lured into the darkness of a tunnel no one was supposed to use. For the Collins family, the revelation brought a cruel mixture of relief and renewed grief. Relief that Emma's presence had finally been confirmed. Grief that such evidence made survival nearly impossible. Her mother, who had kept Emma's room unchanged for 18 years, told a reporter through tears, "I always thought she was waiting for us somewhere. Now I know she was waiting right under our feet." Detectives treated the tunnel like a crime scene frozen in time. Every inch was re-examined. Luminol tests were conducted, soil samples were taken, cadaver dogs were guided through the collapsed sections, their handlers watching closely for any signal of human remains. And while nothing more definitive was found during those first weeks, the hair strand alone was enough to alter the course of the investigation. The case file, once gathering dust in storage, was reopened with urgency. A task force was reassembled, younger detectives now carrying the weight of their predecessors' failures. Old suspects were revisited. Former railway workers were tracked down and interviewed again. Records of maintenance keys and access logs were pulled from archives, cross-checked against employment rosters. If Emma had been taken into that tunnel, someone with knowledge and opportunity had to be responsible. Yet, even as momentum built, one unsettling reality lingered. For all the evidence gathered, Emma herself remained missing. The hair proved she was there. The fibers suggested struggle. But there was still no body, no definitive cause, no clear narrative of what happened once she crossed into that darkness. And as the public watched with a mixture of fascination and dread, the question deepened. If Emma entered that tunnel nearly 2 decades ago, what else might still be waiting inside? By the summer of 2021, the tunnel that once existed only in rumor had become the central focus of a full-scale investigation. Detectives, forensic teams, and engineers descended almost daily, determined to uncover what had been hidden for nearly 2 decades. The discoveries of fabric fibers and Emma Collins's hair strand had changed everything. Now, every inch of the tunnel was treated as a crime scene, frozen in time, carrying secrets waiting to be pulled from its walls. Progress came slowly. Dust, collapsed sections, and unstable supports made navigation dangerous. Teams in protective gear moved carefully, cataloging each object with painstaking precision. That was when they began to notice remnants that were small but chilling. Near a corner where water dripped steadily, a broken shoe heel was found, wedged between rusted bolts. The style matched women's footwear from the early 2000s. Its leather had long decayed, but the shape was unmistakable. Investigators bagged it immediately, knowing it might have once belonged to Emma. Not far from that spot, under a beam that had shifted during a collapse, faint scratches lined the concrete. They were uneven, shallow in some places, and deep in others, as if made by fingernails dragged in desperation. Technicians photographed them under every angle, measuring the grooves, comparing them to human nail width. While no DNA could be retrieved, the marks told a story all their own, of someone trapped, someone who tried to claw their way out. The most unsettling find came deeper in, where an old padlock hung from a chain bolted to a rusted door. The lock was so corroded it could barely be recognized, but its placement was unusual. Investigators concluded it had been used to seal a passage long after the tunnel had been abandoned, an effort to block entry to a section that wasn't meant to be accessed. Why it was there and who had placed it became the subject of tense speculation among the team. At this stage, ground-penetrating radar was brought in. Engineers pushed equipment through narrow passages, sending signals into the earth. The results came back with a startling anomaly. Behind one collapsed wall, there appeared to be a hollow space, an alcove deliberately sealed by rubble. The void measured just large enough to hide a small chamber. To investigators, it was the discovery they had been waiting for. Excavation began immediately. The process was dangerous. Workers had to stabilize surrounding structures before breaking through. Dust filled the air as hammers struck stone, every echo bouncing through the tunnel with eerie resonance. Detectives watched silently, the Collins family waiting above ground for updates. After days of effort, a crack opened, revealing a dark gap beyond. When cameras were lowered inside, the footage showed what looked like a man-made alcove, its walls smoother than the rest of the tunnel, as if reinforced deliberately. For the first time since 2003, police went public with a statement that shifted the tone of the case entirely. They announced that evidence strongly suggested Emma Collins had died inside the tunnel, likely sealed away during or shortly after her disappearance. The words sent shockwaves through the city. Vigils that year drew larger crowds than ever before, candles and flowers covering the steps of City Hall. Emma's parents, visibly trembling, said they had prayed for years to find her alive, but were grateful at least for the truth beginning to emerge. The statement also ignited fury from others. Families of women who had gone missing in the same decade demanded answers of their own. If Emma had been hidden in the tunnel for nearly 20 years, could their daughters have met the same fate? Advocates organized press conferences, holding up photographs of other missing women, their faces lined across banners that read, "Where are they?" The tunnel was no longer just Emma's story. It had become a symbol of every unanswered disappearance. Detectives faced mounting pressure. They reassured the public that no conclusion would be reached until excavation was complete and every inch of the chamber documented. Yet behind closed doors, many admitted they were convinced. The broken heel, the scratches, the DNA, taken together, the tunnel was not just circumstantial. It was the grave they had been searching for all along. The Collins family waited outside the sealed entrance as work continued, listening to the hum of machinery below. Each strike of a hammer felt like one step closer to ending years of silence, but with each hour came dread as well. If Emma was truly inside, then they were not just recovering evidence. They were exhuming their daughter's final moments, trapped beneath concrete walls that had remembered what no one else could. As weeks stretched on, anticipation grew unbearable. Media vans lined the street above, reporters broadcasting live updates every evening. Commentators debated whether Emma had been a victim of opportunity or if someone had deliberately used the tunnel to imprison her. Old suspects were discussed again, names resurfacing in headlines, but none of it mattered to Emma's family. For them, only one truth remained relevant, that after 18 years of waiting, the walls themselves seemed ready to give her back. When the excavation team finally broke through the last wall of rubble, the tunnel exhaled air that had been sealed for nearly 2 decades. What they uncovered was not just a cavity in the earth, but a chamber built, or at least maintained, for concealment. Lights were lowered inside, cutting through layers of dust to reveal a narrow space no wider than a small bedroom. Every surface bore signs of human presence, frozen since the spring of 2003. Along the floor lay makeshift bedding, torn fabric arranged into a thin layer, scraps of cushioning pulled from discarded chairs, and what looked like the remnants of a blanket so degraded it disintegrated under touch. Scattered around were food wrappers, the brand logos faded, but still recognizable as products sold in the early 2000s. They were dated by expiration markings, confirming they had been placed there around the time Emma vanished. Among them sat a single wallet, worn but intact. Inside was an ID card bearing Emma Collins's name and photograph. After 18 years of searching, the proof was undeniable. She had been here. At the far wall, investigators found skeletal remains. The bones were fragile, pressed against concrete as though the person had used their body weight in a futile attempt to shift the debris that sealed the chamber. The posture told a devastating story. Knees bent, arms extended upward, fingers curled against stone. Forensic anthropologists would later describe it as a position consistent with someone trapped, struggling to push rubble away until their final moments. The remains were treated with the utmost care. Each bone was catalogued, lifted gently, and placed in protective casings for transport. Initial examination suggested they belonged to a young adult woman of Emma's height and build. But what chilled investigators most was what clung beneath the fingernails, traces of cement dust embedded so deeply it could only have come from clawing at the sealed wall. Laboratory analysis confirmed it. She had been alive inside the alcove after it was blocked, whether by accident or intent, and she had tried desperately to free herself. The evidence painted a bleak but coherent picture. Emma had been forced or lured into the tunnel on the night of her disappearance. At some point, the chamber was sealed, possibly by a collapse, possibly by someone deliberately trapping her. Forensics showed she did not die instantly. Food wrappers suggested she survived for several days. Dehydration and lack of ventilation likely took her before rescue could ever come. She had been within reach of the world above, yet invisible, sealed behind concrete where no one thought to look. The revelation shook the city. For nearly 2 decades, Emma's disappearance had been a riddle, her fate speculated on in whispers and online forums. Now the truth was laid bare, more harrowing than any theory had predicted. News broadcasts lingered on the image of her ID card, a mundane artifact that suddenly carried the weight of tragedy. Reporters repeated the detail of cement dust under her nails, calling it the most haunting evidence of all, proof that she had fought until her body gave out. For Emma's family, the discovery was shattering. Her parents were escorted to the site after the chamber was secured, standing silently as officials confirmed what they had long feared. Her mother collapsed into tears at the mention of the food wrappers, the thought of her daughter surviving for days in isolation too much to bear. Her father gripped the railing, his knuckles white, whispering over and over, "She was right here." Their vigil candle, which had burned in their window for 18 years, suddenly felt both vindicated and unbearable. Detectives, too, were shaken. Many had inherited the case file over the years, combing through cold leads and dead theories. To know, Emma had been alive in the days after she vanished, trapped within feet of where they had searched, left a lingering sense of guilt. One retired investigator admitted in an interview that the discovery would haunt him until his death. "We looked everywhere but there," he said, "and all along she was waiting." The forensic timeline was precise. Survival estimates based on food consumption and environmental conditions suggested Emma lasted between 3 to 5 days. That meant when officers and volunteers searched the tracks, when dogs sniffed the perimeters, when family plastered the city with flyers, Emma was still alive, entombed underground, clawing at cement she could never move. The cruelty of that truth was almost too much to comprehend. As details spread, public outrage grew. Families of other missing women demanded wider searches of abandoned infrastructure. Advocates asked how a chamber so close to the line could have gone unchecked for years. Officials scrambled to defend past decisions, but no explanation seemed adequate. The phrase "missed opportunity" appeared in every editorial. Yet for all the anger, there was also a grim closure. Emma had not vanished into thin air. She had not run away, nor become an unsolvable ghost story. Her final days were brutal, but they were now known. She could be buried with dignity, mourned properly, remembered not as a question mark, but as a daughter who fought to the end. When her remains were returned to her parents, they held a small funeral, attended by the few friends who had stood by through the long years. The candle in the window was extinguished for the first time since 2003. The flame was no longer needed. The chamber that had waited 22 years had finally spoken, and the silence that haunted the family was replaced by a truth both devastating and undeniable. The excavation of the hidden chamber had answered the question of where Emma Collins spent her final days, but investigators still needed to understand how she got there. For months after her remains were recovered, detectives combed through employment records, old security logs, and personnel files from the Railway Authority. The breakthrough came when they focused on access keys. Who had them, who might have known about sealed service hatches, and who had both the opportunity and the temperament to exploit them. One name rose quickly to the surface, a man whose past had already drawn scrutiny, but had never been tied definitively to Emma. He was a former railway maintenance worker, dismissed in 2004 for misconduct involving unauthorized entry into restricted areas. Colleagues described him as volatile, prone to sudden anger, and obsessed with the infrastructure others had long forgotten. Old reports noted that he often lingered near sealed hatches, boasting that he knew parts of the system no one else remembered. More damning, his work log placed him on shift the very week Emma vanished. Investigators pieced together that he still held a set of keys even after disciplinary action should have required him to return them. Those keys included access to the service hatch nearest the section of line where Emma disappeared. Detectives reconstructed the likely sequence of events. On the night of her disappearance, as the train slowed through the dark stretch, he used the service hatch to enter the tunnel. When the lights flickered and passengers heard what they thought was a mechanical noise, or perhaps a muffled scream, Emma was being pulled from her carriage. Evidence suggested he dragged her through the hatch and into the tunnel, where he kept her briefly before sealing her inside the chamber. The bedding, the wrappers, the scratches on the wall all confirmed she was left alive, trapped beyond reach. But the tragedy deepened with the discovery of construction patterns in the alcove wall. Forensic engineers determined that the collapse sealing Emma inside was not entirely accidental. Marks on the stone showed tools had been used to shift rubble into place, as though someone had tried to disguise the alcove's existence. The structure then gave way completely, blocking Emma in so tightly that even her abductor could not retrieve her. In his attempt to cover his crime, he had doomed her to die alone in the dark. The man himself had died years earlier of natural causes, never questioned about Emma, never charged, never even linked to the case in official records. His death meant there would be no trial, no confession, no chance for the Collins family to confront him. The truth had remained entombed with Emma until 2021, when technology and persistence finally unearthed it. Detectives concluded their final report with certainty. Emma Collins had been abducted by a disgraced railway worker, left to perish in a sealed alcove he created, and forgotten until her remains were recovered 18 years later. When authorities formally closed the case, the announcement carried both weight and sorrow. For nearly 2 decades, Emma's family had endured rumors, false suspects, and years of unanswered questions. Now the answers were clear, but they brought no comfort. Her father said quietly at the press briefing, "We asked for the truth. We never imagined it would look like this." The memorial service held after the investigation was unlike the vigils of previous years. It was not about waiting, not about hoping. It was about finality. Friends, relatives, and former classmates filled the small church, their candles flickering against stained glass. Emma's belongings recovered from the alcove were displayed at the front, the fragments of bedding, the battered wallet, and, most heartbreakingly, a diary fragment written in her hand. In faded ink, on a scrap torn from a notebook, she had left words that investigators found wedged in a corner of the chamber. The message read, "If they find me, tell them I kept waiting for the train to stop. Unitenti." Her brother read those words aloud at the service. The room fell into silence. It was Emma's voice, reaching across 18 years, reminding everyone of the ordinary hope she had carried, even in her final hours, that the nightmare would end, that the train would halt, that someone would come for her. The diary fragment was buried with her, sealed in the coffin beside her remains, a final testament to the fight she endured and the truth that was finally uncovered. In the weeks that followed, the Collins family extinguished the candle that had burned in their window every night since 2003. For the first time, their house was dark, no longer calling Emma home. They had their answers, and though they were unbearable, they were complete. The tunnel had kept its secret for 22 years, but in the end, the walls had spoken. Emma's case, once the city's most haunting mystery, was closed at last.